How are you? My name is David B. Lyons and thanks for tuning in to another video from The Open Author. Today we're going to be discussing how you can come up with names for your characters. Now for some reason, when it comes to students I teach in universities and colleges as well as students that I have online, I'm constantly asked how to come up with character names, which is quite odd to me because this is just one of those things that comes easy to me. I'm not somebody that has to specifically study character names. I just tend to lie in bed and wait until one pops into my head, or I sit with my hands hovered over the keyboards until an appropriate name pops into my head. But I have done a lot of research on this one over the past couple of years on how other authors and how other ambitious writers come up with names for their characters. So I'm going to share the best hints and tips I've heard over the years, and we'll put it all into this neat little video, okay? So why don't we get straight down to it? Okay, so I just want to say from the outset that this video is specifically about naming your characters. It's not about building your characters from scratch. So by this stage, when you're naming your characters, or certainly the advice and the hints and tips you're going to get in this video, in order for this to work, you will already know who your character is, okay? So you will know your character ethnicity, you will know your character's appearance, you will know your character's personality and his or her traits. So what the hints and tips will do here is they will help you bring out those specific characteristics within your character to get the perfect name for them. So if you don't know who your character is, these hints and tips aren't necessarily going to work. So I'm going to assume that if you continue to listen past this point in this video, you already know who your character is. And now we're going to give you hints and tips on how you can get the perfect name for them. So let's get to the first tip. The first one is come up with the surname first. Now, this will sound like a no-brainer to you when I say this, but the truth is, it's difficult for you to come up with a full name in one package. So give yourself the best advantage by knowing the surname first, because let's be honest, everybody is born with a surname. In fact, before we're even born, we most likely have a surname, okay? So once you have a surname, you have a platform in which to build the perfect name. And surnames are easier to come up with because you can relate them directly to personality or to some sort of traits that your character has. So there's a host of surnames out there that you can give that will suit your character. So for example, Rock is a surname. It's a name that you can give to somebody who you want to give off the impression is particularly hard or particularly solid in their personality. So Rock sort of lends itself to a personality trait, as does Stone to a lesser extent in the same realm. Hale is a surname. Rush is a surname that you might give somebody who's quite panicky. Lavender is another surname for somebody you might think is a particularly cozy character or something like that. Okay, so I'm probably not giving you the best examples there, but what I am trying to say to you is that surnames can distinctly relate to a personality trait that you already know about as a writer. So we see this all the time, where perhaps a particularly heroic character or a nice character is often called Goodman. That's the surname, Goodman, because he's a good man. Okay, so I'm gonna go through some hints and tips on how you can come up with that perfect surname to suit your character. Now the thing about it is you don't want to be overly explicit and obvious when it comes to this, okay? So if your character is a keen race car driver, calling her Tina Ferrari is just a little bit too explicit. So the idea is to tone it down so that it's not obvious to your reader that the surname shouts out what their personality trait is, but you as the writer, you're always aware that this surname suits your character perfectly. And in a little bit of hope that it sort of seeps in, or the name particularly seeps into the mind of the reader to give off the character trait without being obvious that you're giving off the character trait. So the tip I'm really trying to give you here is to give insight into your character personality through the surname, but don't be obvious. So one tip I'm going to give you throughout all the hints I give you here is Google is your friend. So for example, if you want to give off the impression that your character is particularly gentle character, so someone who's quite gentle and timid, well, a search on Google to ask Google, what names relate to gentle will give you an answer. So the surname Clement, Clement, derives from the word gentle, okay? So that's what that name stands for. So that is a perfect surname for you to use for your nice, gentle character, Clement. So Google is always your friend in that regard. So whatever it is, whatever character trait or character personality that you sort of want to embed in your surname, you can ask Google and it will give you a surname that is not obvious and not explicit. Because gone are the days where your Goodman would actually be called Goodman. We're done with that. So try and be subtle in the surname. And then once you have built, or once you have settled on a surname, well then coming up with the first name is going to be easier. And then once we've done that, we move on to tip number 2, which is the name can be dependent on whether or not your character is peripheral or main. So whether your character is either a peripheral character or a main character within your story. And here's why. Because what will happen is if your character is peripheral, so not somebody who's mainly there throughout the entire story arc, well then it's dependent on whether you want your reader to really remember who that character is. So a peripheral character might be somebody who's painted lightly through the novel, and then that character actually becomes quite prominent or important at the end. So the end twist might lead to you remembering, or the reader remembering, who that character was. And of course, apart from that, there's a lot of peripheral characters that are just in there to help carry plot forward, so they're not that integral really to the story, and they don't pop up again. So the reason I'm saying there needs to be a difference between your peripheral characters is if you don't necessarily want your reader to remember them so much, well then you can give them an everyday name that is quite forgetful or forgettable. So names like John or James, or my own name, David, because they're so common, you can give characters that you don't want to be remembered those kind of names. Whereas if you actually want your reader to remember a peripheral character because he or she might pop up again, or they are integral to the twist or another plot point later on in the story, well then you should give them a more memorable name, because then when the reader sees it pop up again, they'll go, oh, I remember Xavi. I remember Xavi, that name popped up. That's Lauren's friend that she used to go to college with. So if you give them a standout name that is not quite common, well then it is very likely that your reader will remember it as soon as it pops up again. So it's dependent on whether your peripheral characters are meant to be noted by your reader. So for example, in my latest book, I called one of the peripheral characters who was just spoken about early on in the novel, but in the latter part of the novel became quite prominent. I called him Luke, but I spelt it differently. So I spelled it L-U-U-K because he was a character from Holland. So that made his name quite memorable to the reader. So when it popped up again about 60% through the novel, they could relate it to when he was spoken about before. So remember, it doesn't have to be that really vivid, but you should be producing names that will be memorable for your readers if you want that peripheral character to stay inside the mind of your reader. So that is for peripheral characters' first names. When it comes to your main characters' first names, this is my tip. It's all about feel. Now, when I say it's all about feel, I mean it's all about the feel that the full name gives off. So remember where you are. You already have the surname. You're trying to fit in a first name that gives the reader, or yourself as the writer, an overall feel of who this character is. Now, as I mentioned already, I don't really have the issue of coming up with character names. They seem to come to me quite easily. But what I will say here is, if you already have a surname, very early indicators might lead you to coming up with at least an initial that you would like for the first name of one of your main characters. So if you have settled on the surname Clement, well then you might already be thinking of an L name for that female protagonist that you really like, okay? So you might think the L will go well with the Clement, the second letter of that surname. So my tip in that regard then is, again, Google is your friend. You will find out or note from your own character biography or your own character profile that you've done up to build this character of when your character was born or how old she was. So if your character is 29, say, this Ms. Clement that we haven't named yet, but we think we might call her something beginning with L, well, you might Google the year she was born and popular names in Britain or Ireland or America or whatever it is your character is from. So what were the popular names in 1990 when Ms. Clement was born? And then you might get a list of the top 100 names that were given out that year or children were named that year, and you might find one that fits. And then you're being kind of quite appropriate to the surname because you know that in the time period your character was born, this name was quite popular. And you might, if you already have in your mind the fact that you would like to name your character with the letter beginning with L, you might find an L name along that list. If you don't, or you're not happy with the L names on that list, again, Google is your friend. You can just Google first names beginning with L, and it's most likely then, given the thousands of responses that you will have to that Google search, find the perfect name that suits with the surname. So you might settle on Lily Clement or something like that, or Lizzie Clement as your character name, because that gives you the feel that you want your readers to feel about this specific character. So Lizzie or Lily Clement, if you think that suits, you get the feels. I sound like Katy Perry here. If you're getting those feels, that's the right name for your character, well then don't mess with it. You have it. You've nailed it. So if you know the initial, well then it's a case of Googling names beginning with that initial. Or if you know when your character was born, and you should do because you already should have built the character before you come to the name, well then you can Google the popular names in the year that character was born. So it really isn't as difficult as some students lead me to believe they feel it is, coming up with character names. I think a lot of people perhaps just obsess about it too much, that they think it's more important than it actually is, that if they don't get the character name right, they're not going to get the whole story right. Listen, a character name is akin to a baby name in a sense that once a baby is given that name, whether you like it or not, they become that person, right? So if your best friend called their kid Montgomery as a first name and you didn't particularly like it, you know what? Fuck you. Because in a few days' time or a few weeks' time, after you've met Monty a few times, he becomes Monty, okay? So that is his name and he'll always be that guy. And it's a bit like that with your characters. Your readers will just buy into the name and that character will become that name. So don't obsess about it. Don't feel any pressure about names. It's quite fun actually. So come up with a surname, as I said, that gives your character a personality trait, and then just find the appropriate first name that gives you an overall good feel that that's exactly who this character is. The only other thing I would say about naming characters is don't name characters with the same first initial, particularly if the initials sounds the same. So you shouldn't have a character John and James, because it's most likely that your reader might get confused. Which John again? Yeah, no, James is the one that had the sister called Lily. No, it was John that had it. Calling them very similar names will make your reader sort of get mixed up between the two characters. So that's another tip that you should take on board actually. Don't call different characters by the same initial. Now you might call them by the same initial if the sound is different. So you might have, for example, Charlie and Karis in the same story. So the Karis has a hard C sound to it, whereas Charlie obviously has that CH sound to it. So it's unlikely that the reader is going to get mixed up with those two. But my tip would be, if you can avoid, and you should be able to avoid naming characters, whether they're peripheral or main characters, by the same initial, do. Now, so they're my tips on naming characters set in novels within the real world. Now, I want to touch on fantasy novels and fantasy names here because I think that's probably one of the main areas that writers or amateur writers get a bit muddled and feel a bit of pressure when they're coming up with fantasy names. But my advice is, and this is advice from somebody who doesn't write fantasy, okay, so you might take this with a pinch of salt, but I actually think you will appreciate this piece of advice. There's no bloody pressure whatsoever to get it right. You're the writer, you're the creator of this piece of work. So whatever you come up with, those characters will become characters with those names. So no pressure about it. So the great thing about it is you can be a little bit playful when it comes to character traits or character personalities within your fantasy character names. So if we think of the greatest sci-fi or fantasy ever written in terms of a different medium, I guess, in movie history, but Star Wars. So George Lucas, who wrote Star Wars, called one of his main protagonists Luke Skywalker. Skywalker, somebody that walks amongst the skies. So he was quite obvious in that, yet I bet so many people who have watched Star Wars haven't even twigged how explicit that name is towards a character trait or personality, because Luke Skywalker just is Luke Skywalker, and that's who he is. We haven't even thought to question his name. And of course, also in Star Wars, the main antagonist is called Darth Vader. So this one's quite explicit, and you might kick yourself if you have watched Star Wars and you didn't quite catch this. But Darth, meaning dark, and Vader, meaning father. So Dark Father is, of course, Darth Vader, who ends up, as I'm sure you know, being the dark father of Luke Skywalker. So that was George Lucas creating one of the great fantasy franchises of all time, being quite explicit with the names of his characters in his fantasy world. But you don't have to be as explicit or as obvious with your surnames. So if your character is a Skywalker, you don't necessarily have to call him or her Skywalker, but you can still give off personality traits or character attributes or insights into who your character really is, such as Darth Vader, in a much more creative way. Okay, so let's have a look at how we can do that. So one fun way to come up with fantasy names for characters is to know the explicit character trait and then hop on to anagram.com and find an anagram of that trait to give your character that surname or first name. So for example, this is a very raw example, but if your character is evil, well then you might think of naming him Levi, which is an anagram of evil. But I mean, that might be a bit of an explicit example there for you. But if your character, say, is holding a secret that maybe you don't even want your readers to know about, well, you know, puts the word secret into anagram.com and see if that comes up with an appropriate surname for you. Or if your character is humble, put humble into anagram.com and see if it can come up with a surname for you. So using anagrams, mixing around letters of a particular character trait that you might want to hold from your reader, that's a good way of coming up with fantasy names. And of course, fantasy names, because it's a fantasy world, can be anything. So the world is your oyster really in this regard. It doesn't have to relate to a specific surname that we know. So using anagram.com to mix around the words of a character trait is really one good way, an interesting and creative way to go about it. But there's another way. You could also find foreign words for the different character traits that you might want to give off. So for example, Darth Vader, Vader means father in German. So you might have a look around, again, Google is your friend, at different languages and see what names they give off as definitions for the particular character trait or words that you're looking for. So there's quite a number of ways that you can come up with the fantasy name, but building a character trait in to that fantasy name is likely to be something that you want to do, because it gives you as a writer constant guidance that you know rock solid who this particular character is and what his main character trait is or her main character trait is. And it's also nice to give out little hints and tips and teasers to the reader to see if they can quite twig the secret that you peppered into that name. So they are the tips that I can give you for naming characters in the real world and naming characters in fantasy worlds. So they're not mind-blowing tips. But I'm hoping you took something from this little video. If you would like to hear more from me, do hit the red button below, subscribe to these videos, one drops every week, or visit theopenauthor.com where all these videos are listed. You will also on that website get a wealth of information about how you can begin to start your novel. And if you are beginning to tinker with some words, please share what you've written so far on my Facebook page, Future Author Society, where there are a range of authors just like you, hoping to make a breakthrough in the game, trying to write their first novel, and we all help and support each other as they're going through the process. So if you want to share some of your writing with us for some constructive feedback, that's the place to do it. So I hope to see you there. If not, I'll see you in the next video, and I'll talk to you soon.